Once upon a time, there was a man who played speed duels. This man did not want to play meta. This man simply wanted the spice.
Hey Legacy community, it's Terramaster, and today, finally, I'm here for you with the Viral Despair deck profile. The deck that I showed you, the anti-conflict deck from Show Me the Spice episode 2, showing you that deck in action against Inner Conflict Jinzo. If you want to see that and you haven't yet, it's going to be in the cards right about now, so check that out. And now, without further ado, let's get into the deck profile. First, we have Seto Kaiba is the character, and the skill is, of course, Viral Infection. So we're just going to put that over here, and let's get right into the deck. I guess I should, just in case. Viral Infection lets you discard any number of cards from your hand once per turn and declare a type of card, monster, spell, or trap, and that allows you to force your opponent to mill the equal amount of that type of card from their deck to the graveyard, but they get to choose. Anyway, let's get right into the deck profile here. The first 3 cards are 3 copies of your big boss monster, which gives you your big advantage over the Inner Conflict deck because of its stat line of 2800 and 3000. This is stronger than their boss monster, which is Jinzo. So therefore, once you get Despair from the Dark on the field and you have used your skill to successfully mill all their spell cards, they do not have a way to get rid of your Despair from the Dark unless they still have their skill, in which case they can only get rid of 1 Despair from the Dark. Alright, let's move on to the next monster here, which is 3 copies of your second zombie. Yes, so this is a zombie themed Viral Infection deck, so you discard your big zombies in order to get rid of whatever you need to from your opponent's deck, and then it's all about revival after that. Anyway, so Zumbina is your second zombie because of all the revival cards, which you'll see later, that are in the deck. You do need to have more than just 3 zombies, and Zumbina is also really good because it combines with some of our level 4 lower monsters, because when Zumbina is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, it procs and special summons a level 4 lower monster from your graveyard except Zumbina. So let me show you one of the monsters that Zumbina combines very well with. This is going to be your main Zumbina target, and that is New Doria. 3 copies of New Doria. This is very good for the deck in that it can help you destroy your opponent's monsters when it's just a battle, and it can also come back with Zumbina in what was known in the Trials format when this skill first came out as the Zumbina loop. It was used back then with Yomi ship, but obviously New Doria is a step above Yomi ship, in my opinion. Let's go on to your second target for Zumbina, because of course you can't have just 3 Zombinas with just 3 targets. So a potential other target for Zumbina that could also be really good is Gentle Mander. Now the best part about this is Gentle Mander also serves as a hand trap. And what makes it really cool with Zumbina is that if your Zumbina is destroyed while you already have a Gentle Mander in your graveyard, you can bring that Gentle Mander back. Then when they try to attack into that Gentle Mander, as long as you have another one in your hand, you can play that one as well. And when 2 Gentle Manders are on the field, it creates a lock where your opponent cannot attack, because Gentle Mander has an effect that your opponent has to attack Gentle Mander and cannot attack other monsters you control. The 2 of them creates a lock. Let's look once again at the second hand trap of the deck. So this deck does have a lot of survivability because it does have 6 hand traps. And because of that, there's no need to run any regular traps. So it's really a anti-conflict Jinzo deck in every way, in that you don't even have a lot of traps, or any traps really, for the Jinzo to negate. So you are completely unaffected by Jinzo's effect, if that makes any sense. So Sphere Curb, obviously everybody knows, it's your classic hand trap just for survivability in case they get their OTK play on the field, their 4000 damage, and they try to go in for it. You have a Sphere Kuriboh, you will survive, and in a worst case scenario, remember, it can just be discard fodder for your infection if you don't need it to stop an attack. Now I think we are ready to move on to the spells, and let's start with removal. So your 2 pieces of removal in the deck are your 2 copies of offerings to the dude. Now, once again, same concept as Midoriya, it is always really important to have removal because for one thing, Moth still exists in the format, so you need it for that. For another, if there's ever a situation where you do have to kill against conflict, you do have to kill one of their Jinzos or one of their warrior monsters, which, like say Command Knight is giving them a buff to make them, one of their warriors somehow be stronger than your Despair, then you can go ahead and use the offerings to get rid of that. Offerings is very good, it's a good utility card, utility removal to have in a deck like this. And let's move on to another spell in the deck, which you actually have 3 of, which is Supply Squad. Now I want to give a shout out to Discord user Goblin of Greed, or he's also known as Giant's Bane in the Speed Duel community, for suggesting this addition to the deck, as it is absolutely insane, especially with the Zumbina loop, because every time a monster is destroyed once per turn, you draw a card. And if you activate 2 Supply Squads, that's a pot of greed every time a monster on your side of the field is destroyed. So it works extremely well with Zumbina, and it works extremely well with Gentlemander. You'll see that happen almost immediately in the duel replay where I showed the deck off, where your opponent attacks while you have no monsters on the field, you summon a Gentlemander from your hand with its effect, and they run over it, and you have a Supply Squad, you draw a card. And if you have 2 Supply Squads, that is essentially a pot of greed every time your opponent destroys a monster you control. And what's really good about this deck is that, once again, any card you draw, you don't have to worry about deck out, because you will deck your opponent out almost guaranteed before you even have to worry about decking out. And there's no dead draws in this deck, because the dead draw is just a discard fodder for the skill. Alright, let's go finally to the final 4 cards of the deck, which is the Revival package here. We have 1 copy of Book of Life, because it's slow and it requires a monster in your opponent's graveyard for you to activate it. So therefore Book of Life is not anywhere near as good as the other card, Haunted Shrine, which is obviously a trap, so its spell speed 2 can be used on your opponent's turn, as well as it doesn't require the condition of your opponent already having a monster in their graveyard. Now, why Haunted Shrine specifically counters Inner Conflict Jinzo is because Haunted Shrine has a graveyard effect. The first effect is when you control no monsters, you can activate it on your field like a regular trap, and special summon 1 zombie from your graveyard. However, it's the second effect that we're focused on here, because what you want to do against Conflict Jinzo is you do not want to set Haunted Shrine, you instead want to discard it to the graveyard immediately. And then you use its graveyard effect, you discard Haunted Shrine, and ideally you have a zombie in your graveyard, either discard it or it's a Zumbina and it goes to the graveyard. And then you use your Haunted Shrine's graveyard effect, which is when you have no monsters, you banish Haunted Shrine from the graveyard and special summon 1 zombie from your graveyard. Now, what makes that really good is it does have the drawback of the monster you special summon with its graveyard effect. Its effects are negated, but both Zumbina and Despair from the Dark, well, Despair from the Dark doesn't have an effect on the field, so it doesn't care. Zumbina also does not have an effect on the field. Zumbina's effect actually activates in the graveyard after Zumbina is destroyed and hits the graveyard. Therefore, Haunted Shrine is absolutely amazing against Jinzo, since Jinzo cannot negate its graveyard effect. So remember, against Conflict Jinzo, you always discard the Shrine. You never set it on the field, because if they summon that Jinzo, then your Shrine is stuck face down on your field and you can't do anything with that. Now, let's talk about the side deck. And before we get into that, I want to quickly say that against Inner Conflict, your deck is kind of already perfect for that matchup, so you don't need to side deck anything. However, what you will need to side deck for is against the second most powerful deck, in my opinion, in the format, and that is Moth. So here's the quick 3-card package you would have to side in against a Moth deck. And that is Forceful Checkpoint ×2 and 1 more Offerings to Doom. So you grab your 3rd Offerings, because if you're guaranteed playing against Moth, you need as many Moth answers as possible. In addition, Moth decks will also run Gap. And speaking of Gap, Gap is also a card that can be scary against you. In addition to Hades, I had trouble with Hades in one of the games I played with this deck, but I managed to win because my Offerings and my Midoriya managed to kill off 2 Hades. So That's why putting in the third offering is very important. If they have any monster like that, like Moth, which can get over your despair, or Gap, which can force your Zumbina and your Nidorias into attack mode and do damage to you, or Hades, which just straight up negates your Zumbina and Nidoria. So anything like that, you need offerings in order to out that. And Forceful Checkpoint, obviously, why am I putting down the main deck? Forceful Checkpoint obviously is perfect to side against Moth, because if you remember in the Trials of the Kingdom format, where Moth was the dominant deck, Forceful Checkpoint was used to try to get those parasites and moths out of your opponent's hand and negate an attack before they ever got a chance to play them. So once again, Forceful Checkpoint is the perfect counter for Moth, especially if they have to go aggro, which against a deck like this one, they do have to go aggro, so it works out perfectly. Now that we're done with the Moth matchup, another matchup to consider, which these next three cards are for, is anything with playing Twisted Personality. So that can be either Twisted Warrior or Twisted Stall Burn. And we have Vampire Lord to counter the Twisted Personality skill, so that they can't destroy it with their skill. Because if they do destroy it by their skill, or even Offerings to the Doomed, any card effect, Vampire Lord comes back. And especially Twisted Warriors, they do not typically run monsters with over 2,000 attack points. So for them to destroy a Vampire Lord by battle is going to be really, really hard. So that's what makes Vampire Lord an amazing side deck against all those decks. And then those decks tend to use a lot of trap cards, right? So we have to side Jinzo against any Twisted Personality deck, because Jinzo will just stop all their Zomas, it stops all their Nightmare Wheels, and they rely on those two cards a lot. And finally, this is purely for anti-burn, that is Golden Ladybug. With Golden Ladybug, potentially there's a chance, even if they're a really good stall deck, you can either mill out a lot of their good cards, or you can stall until you draw into your Jinzo to negate their traps, and then hopefully with a Despair or something like that, just go in for game. So that's the deck profile. There is an extra deck too. I'll just show it to you really fast. They're just the 6 best extra deck monsters I have access to. Yep, 3,000 extra strict. You don't really access the extra deck, but you should always have an extra deck just in case, and at least just for intimidation. That's the deck profile. I hope you guys play it. I hope you enjoy defeating Inner Conflict, because real quick before I go, let me just say I entered this deck in Speed Duel League Win a Box number 3, and I went 4-2, and my 4 wins, out of my 4 wins, 3 of them were against Inner Conflict Jinzo, and the last one was against a Gaia deck, which I ran into. And my 2 losses were against an Inner Conflict Jinzo deck, but he was siding DD Crow. So that at that point, it just comes down to whether or not he can out one of my Despair plays, and then if I can go ahead and make a second one before he kills me. So at that point, it becomes a little harder for you to beat that that Conflict deck, but it's still not impossible, because remember, DD Crow, unless they side multiple, in which case it just becomes a dead card for them sometimes, and you can just go aggro once you realize that they're not doing anything. So that's another thing with this deck, is that if you see the right situation, do not be afraid to go aggressive with your big 2800 monster. And my other loss was to a Moth deck. So yes, Moth is a bad matchup, but you play an anti-meta deck because you're predicting what the meta is going to be. And it's not like you'll never beat Moth. You still have a chance to beat Moth if you can get your checkpoints off, and if you can Offerings the Moth. There's definitely still a good chance you can beat even Moth decks, even though it's not a good matchup. But I didn't make top cut, unfortunately, due to tiebreakers. However, if you just look at the Inner Conflict matchup, which is the one we were focused on, I did win 3 out of 4 of those, and the 4th one I barely lost, and that was because of DD Crow. So that's all I got for you guys. I hope you enjoyed this deck profile, and Terra Master out.